Good morning. Good morning, all. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you very much indeed for being here. We've got a very promising, exciting discussion. Let me just quickly, because I see he's come up now on screen, let me introduce, if I may, the U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Nicholas Burns. Ambassador Burns, thank you very much for joining us.
Jerry, nice to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
The topic of this session, Ambassador, is the future of U.S. China relations, and we have 20 minutes. So it's a kind of a speed round for you, I think. But if I may, I'll get stuck straight in with what I think is obviously the most topical issue and the one that's most pressing, certainly back in Washington and I'm sure over here, which is Taiwan. President Biden said last week, I think for the fourth time in less than 2 years since he's been president, that if Taiwan were to be attacked by China, the U.S. would indeed come to its defense with military force. Now that was immediately then, on the previous occasions, that was immediately then clarified, shall we say, or reinterpreted by officials. But I'm wondering, Ambassador, I mean, isn't it now time that we get this message from the president? We seem to be hearing it loud and clear. Is that actually the message now that the United States wants China and the rest of the world to hear?
Well, Jerry, first let me take one step back and thank the Milken Institute for inviting me to participate with you in this session. I would have really liked to have been in Singapore, but there is the zero COVID policy here, and I would have to quarantine for 7 days in coming back. So that's why I'm with you virtually. Jerry, the president spoke to the United Nations General Assembly a week ago yesterday, and he spoke directly to this issue. And he reaffirmed our One China policy of the last 5 decades, the policy that every administration of both parties has adhered to. He also said that the United States, of course, supported a peaceful resolution of the disputes in the Taiwan Strait. And he further said that we don't support and will not support any unilateral change to that status quo. That's a very important statement. If anyone has changed policy here, it's really the People's Republic of China with their overreaction nearly 2 months ago now to Speaker Pelosi's visit. I mean, you saw what they tried to do. We've had a median line in the Taiwan Strait for 68 years. It's really kept the peace. And they tried to erase that. They fired missiles over Taiwan into the Japanese EEZ. They simulated a blockade, a naval and air blockade. So we're actually concerned that the party trying to change policy here now is Beijing. And we've warned them that we won't agree to that. We don't accept it. And you've seen that the United States is carrying on with our policy. Vice President Harris was yesterday in Japan speaking to U.S. military forces, and she reaffirmed we're going to continue to fly and sail and operate where international law allows, and it does allow it, in the Taiwan Strait. That's a rather lengthy answer to your question, but I'm going back to what the president has said and now what the vice president has said.
Thanks, Ambassador. But you say it's the Chinese who've overinterpreted, but they do keep getting these messages from the president. Let me also quote to you what the president said in that same interview. He said, on the question of Taiwanese independence, should that be an issue, Taiwan makes their own judgments about their independence. That's their decision. Now, that does seem to be a pretty significant breach with U.S. policy and the idea of U.S. support for the One China policy. You can at least understand, can you not, that the Chinese are hearing these messages. Okay, they may be subsequently contradicted by officials, but this is the President of the United States. He's the Commander-in-Chief. He's the one who's making the policy. You can at least understand, can't you, why they think the policy may have changed.
Well, Jerry, so the president spoke, as I said, from the rostrum of the UN General Assembly. There isn't a bigger room in the world than that. Just last week, and of course the Chinese were there, and the president reaffirmed our One China policy. That's the greatest concern that the Chinese have. Frankly, it's a concern that we have, that both sides abide by it. So the president was clear. Jake Sullivan has spoken about this. He was clear. Our vice president has spoken. So I don't actually think that's the problem. I think the major problem here is that we're seeing a new offensive, if you will, by the People's Republic of China, very aggressive towards Taiwan. And we've all got to be concerned, everybody in your room in Singapore, with the fact that the majority of container traffic in the world flows through the Taiwan Strait. I think more than 80% of the super containers go through it. It's a lifeline of the global economy, and of course, Singapore's economy, the economy of this region. That's the party that's changing things. And our message to the Chinese privately, as well as publicly over the last 2 months is, we're not going to go along with this. And we're going to try to reinforce the status quo in the Taiwan Strait that's kept the peace for 60 years. I actually don't think the Chinese have any misunderstanding of U.S. policy. They don't agree with our policy, but we've been clear about the one China policy.
And just very briefly, finally on Taiwan, Ambassador, the Congress is currently considering legislation, the Taiwan Policy Act, which would do a number of things, which again, I think the Chinese government are concerned about, and to do with relationships, the diplomatic status of the U.S. representative in Taipei or Taiwan, to do with the broader relationship. Are you concerned that Congress here, as Nancy Pelosi's visit a couple of months ago, that maybe Congress is maybe getting ahead of where the administration wants to be?
Well, of course, I'm aware of this proposed bill. It's a bill that's been voted out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but is not yet law because, and there's a long way to go in our legislative process. It hasn't been voted upon by the full Senate. So we'll just have to see where that bill goes. Of course, the administration is speaking privately to the senators. I shouldn't violate that confidence in this setting about the bill. But I would say this, Jerry, I'm glad you've asked these questions about Taiwan. I think the most important question that all of us, including all nations represented in your conference today, should be asking is China, is the People's Republic of China going to maintain a peaceful resolution of this dispute? Will they adhere to that standard, or will they resort to coercion, intimidation, or military force? That's a question that every member of ASEAN, every major country and smaller country in this region has to be concerned about. And we actually want to hold the Chinese to that standard. You need to act peacefully here, not through military force. I think that's actually the key issue right now in the diplomacy around this.
Let's move on quickly to another big topical issue, of course, which is China's relationship with Russia and the US's relationship with those two countries. We saw the agreement, the partnership that the two countries agreed to just before Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw the meeting that President Putin and Xi Jinping held just a couple of weeks ago, last week actually in Samarkand at the Shanghai Cooperation Council. What's your sense? Can you tell us what you are saying to the Chinese about that relationship and about, obviously the United States is in a, let's be honest, in a kind of a proxy war with Russia and Ukraine right now. China has established itself as its ally. How is that complicating the relationship between the United States and China? What are you saying to the Chinese about how they should be treating with Russia?
We've been very clear with the Chinese privately and publicly in saying that we're watching them very carefully here, that China should not provide military support or support to help Russia evade sanctions, the sanctions that the rest of the world has applied to Russia, and that we'll continue to watch closely. Now, we have not seen any such effort by the PRC, but we continue to watch. And I say this, Jerry, I think what's been really interesting about the Chinese and how they've acted is they're saying one thing to the rest of the world and another thing to their own people. To the rest of the world, and you heard this last week at the United Nations, they're saying, hey, we're neutral, we want peace, we want the war to stop. To their own people, and of course, we're reading the press every day here at our embassy here in Beijing, the press in China, they're saying the United States and NATO instigated this war, they drove Putin to this war, they've made us the problem here when I think any objective person knows that Vladimir Putin crossed the brightest red line in international politics. He fundamentally violated the United Nations Charter. He's assaulting unfairly, illegally, the sovereignty of his neighbor. And you know, if the Chinese have stood for anything in the 7 decades where the Communist Party has been in charge in China since Mao's takeover, they stand for sovereignty of nation states. They stand for territorial integrity. And we would hope the Chinese would be consistent on that. And they have not been consistent because they're saying two different messages to two different parts of the spectrum.
Let's talk about the economic relationship, which is obviously very important, particularly to people here. The Biden administration continues with the tariffs that the Trump administration put in place. I know there's been no final determination yet on whether to lift those. Perhaps you can give us the latest on that. But how do you characterize the broader economic relationship? People have talked about a decoupling between the United States and China that we've been seeing with both companies themselves, but also to some extent in some of these economic policy relationships. Are we headed for a period in which, that period of strategic economic partnership that many people looked for, is that now definitively over? Are the two countries essentially decoupling?
Well, Secretary Blinken said a couple of months ago, Secretary Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, that the United States is not seeking to decouple from China. Here are a couple of data points. We have a $650 billion two-way trade relationship, and it's been increasing in the last couple of years. I think Americans hold about $1.2 trillion in Chinese equities and debt securities. Chinese hold double that amount in the American market. There are 1,100 American companies present here in China. I meet with a lot of them, and thousands more, tens of thousands more trading from the U.S. So it's a big relationship. We're not seeking a decoupling. But of course, we have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which has been around for a long time, which seeks to make sure that Chinese investments in the United States do not cause problems for our national security. And I think there are questions about economic policy here in China. And I think as I listen to the American business community, I listen to the European and Japanese business communities here, every big company is staying here because the market's too important and too big, given the size of China's economy. But I think the studies show that the American and European chambers have just issued that most companies are not making major new investments because they want to see, is there uniformity in economic policy? Is there clarity? Are we going to see a market-friendly policy here or not? And of course, I expect those questions will be answered as the Chinese go through the 20th Party Congress and then beyond it as a new government is formed here by March 2023. It's the best answer I can give you. I do work with a lot of American companies. We're encouraging Americans to invest here as long as it doesn't cross our national security lines. And I think, most companies are very attuned to that.
And just very quickly on those tariffs, again, they were tariffs that were imposed by the Trump administration. The Biden administration has been considering whether to lift them. They did seem to. Are they tied to the current political tension relating to the Nancy Pelosi visit and the Chinese response to that? Is it a purely economic question, or is it set into the broader diplomatic framework?
It's an issue that the president's spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, has answered this question a number of times recently, and she said the issue's with the president. He's not yet made a decision. So since it's with the president and I work for the president, I'm his representative here in Beijing, I can't improve on that answer.
Let's move on then to an issue that you raised that you were very passionate about in your confirmation hearings, which is China's human rights record. We obviously, information is not easily come by, but there's been significant reporting about what's been going on in Xinjiang. We've obviously seen, concern. We've talked about Taiwan. We've seen concerns about Tibet. We've seen the way the Chinese have frankly simply abrogated the joint agreement with the United Kingdom over Hong Kong to essentially abandon all of its commitments that it made, pretty well all of its commitments made to Hong Kong. What are you telling the Chinese there? What are you telling them, and what are they saying to you about their human rights record?
Our message to the Chinese privately and publicly is an identical message, but we do talk about this privately. We raise specific cases with them of people who have been detained here, we believe unfairly and illegally. Of course, we reject what the People's Republic of China has done in Hong Kong. I mean, you know Hong Kong very well, Jerry, and many people in this room do. It's a shadow of what it was. There aren't political freedoms now of a type that people just enjoyed a couple of years ago. Ongoing human rights concerns in Tibet, no question about it. Widespread concerns about religious freedom in China, or the lack of religious freedom. And especially in Xinjiang, I just read a couple of weeks ago the report, not of the United States, but the United Nations Committee on Human Rights. It's a devastating 40-page report, heavily footnoted, saying China is guilty of systematic human rights abuses. They may be guilty of crimes against humanity because of forced labor, because incarcerating hundreds of thousands of people between 2017 and this year. There are reports that mosques are being deconsecrated but also destroyed, that men cannot wear beards, which in Islam is a very important part of the faith for some men, that women cannot wear head coverings. They can't be identifiably Muslim. And all of this is a rejection of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the commitments that China signed up for when it rejoined the United Nations in 1971. And we've been very clear about it. Our president has been very clear about it just last week when he spoke at the UN General Assembly. And frankly, it's an issue that is really very much divides us from the government here, but we're going to continue to raise these cases and individual cases where just egregious violations of people's human rights, exit bans put on people, they can't leave. So it's a major issue, and we're going to continue to be vocal about it.
Other than raising the issue with the Chinese and the president, as you say, making public denunciations of what's going on, is there more that the US wants to do? I mean, in particular, we talked about Xinjiang and we talked about Hong Kong, where China clearly seems to be, at least according to foreign observers, in breach of, as you say, of human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. In Hong Kong, it's in breach of international law. Is the US going to do more than simply verbally condemn?
Well, as you know, we've actually enacted sanctions against Chinese officials involved in the repression of Xinjiang. Sanctions concerning what happened since 2019 and the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. So we've taken real concrete action on this. In addition, as you know, our Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act by an overwhelming margin. Liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans came together. President signed it into law. It's now the law. It essentially says if you're an American company operating in Xinjiang and you want to export a product or a service back to the United States, you've got to be able to prove that in no way was forced labor involved in the supply chain. It's a very high bar, and it was intentionally written to be a high bar. I met online like this virtually with several hundred companies back in June, the month that the law came into being, to tell them that we would be watching, we'd enforce the law, and Homeland Security at the port of entry in the United States would be rejecting products that came in from Xinjiang unless they could pass that test. That's a pretty dramatic example of how seriously we take human rights in Xinjiang and across China.
Ambassador, in a couple of weeks, the National People's Congress will meet. It's a very significant one. It's expected, obviously, to result in Xi Jinping's receiving another term as leader of China. There's been some suggestion that maybe some things have been put on hold pending the NPC, pending that outcome, the COVID zero policy, maybe some of the other things. Are you expecting any change after the People's Congress meeting?
Well, I think there'll be one big change that we'll all see at the end of, as I understand the process, at the end of the conference. They'll announce certain principles and programs and maybe the members of the standing committee, but we really won't know the new ministers of the new government until they have their conference in March, the double conference that they have in the middle part of March. So there's going to be kind of a transition from one People's Republic government to another. Obviously, we have a major relationship, lots of issues we discuss, so we'll continue working with the government here. Of course, we don't want to interfere in any way, shape, or form in the 20th Party Congress. We're not going to do that. But we'll work, especially when the conference ends, to continue to discuss all these issues that you and I have been discussing between the two governments, and then we'll know a lot more by early 2023 of who the members of the new government are.
Very quick, briefly, Ambassador, because we just have 25 seconds according to my clock. Are we in or are we about to enter a new Cold War with China? How would you characterize the relationship?
I actually think, Jerry, I don't think that's the right way to frame it, because the old Cold War was two blocks, but no economic connection. We have a major economic connection. Singapore does. All the ASEAN countries do. Japan, the United States. That makes it different. We need to work with China on climate change, on health issues, global health to support the WHO, on counter-narcotics. So there's an engagement part of our agenda. We also need to confront China and compete with China on technology and what they're doing to what they're doing against their WTO commitments, not creating a level playing field for any of the foreign companies here. I think it's a more complicated competition, frankly, in many ways, than the old Cold War was. That was the first 10 years of my career, by the way. I'm old enough to say that. I remember that relationship. I think this is more complex and more complicated, so I wouldn't use that term. But I would say it's by far the most consequential relationship that we have. It's going to be consequential for peace and security. And as our president said, we want a peaceful future. We do not seek conflict, and we're going to try to compete with China vigorously and then work with China where we can. And we hope the Chinese will reciprocate. They've frozen a lot of our dialogues since Speaker Pelosi's visit. Our message to the Chinese is let's talk, open these dialogues, and let's move forward.
Ambassador Burns, with those youthful looks, it doesn't look possible that you were a protagonist in the first Cold War.
It's true.
Let's hope you're not one in what might be another Cold War. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Thanks.
Jerry, thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. Thanks to the Milken Institute.
Thanks. Goodbye.
For our next segment, please welcome Senior Associate of Business and Program Development at the Milken Institute Asia Center, Yuka Shimokawa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yuka Shimokawa, and I'm from the business development team, and I also lead the Young Leader Circle and Associates in Asia. On behalf of the Asia Center team, we're so delighted to finally be back to a fully in-person and to finally see your faces. I've already overheard a few people saying this is their first trip back to Asia and to Singapore after 2.5 years, so thank you for coming. Before we start our star-studded session on technology, empowering impactful actions, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors and partners. Truly, none of our work would have been possible without the generous support of our strategic partners, sponsors, and media partners who have provided both the financial supporting and intellectual food for thought for a range of events and programs. Especially in this room, I'd like to thank our lunch plenary speaker, Anuj Srivastavas, co-founder and CEO,